Okay, welcome to the August Denver ISSA chapter meeting here. We have here two folks from ForcePoint. They are Charles Keane and Bob Mechler, who's a principal security strategist. They're here from ForcePoint to present to us a modern approach to data protection. So we thank you guys all for being here, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Charles and Bob.
All right, thanks so much. Appreciate that. So thanks everybody for joining today. We have, I think, a really interesting presentation today. We're going to go through some of Bob and my experience in working in the data protection realm, bring you through a couple anecdotes, and then talk about our point of view on how you can modernize your approach to data protection. So just to kick things off, my name is Charles Keane. I am a data protection specialist with ForcePoint. I've been in the data security world for about 12 years now. Before ForcePoint, I was with HP Security for some time as they converged some of their brands together. ArcSight hit Tipping Point and Fortify. Prior to that, I was at a company called Vontu, which really pioneered the data security space and was fortunate enough to see that entire industry be built from the ground up. Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Again, my name is Bob Mechler. I'm a principal security strategist here with ForcePoint. I've been with the company now for about 2 years. Prior to joining ForcePoint, I spent about 23 years at Verizon, and about 18 of those years I was the CISO at Verizon Wireless. So looking forward to the conversation today. And as Scott and Charles both pointed out, we're going to talk more about a modern approach to data protection. And I want to kind of just start off by setting the stage. Why are we even going to talk about this? Why is this so important today? And hopefully you're seeing on the screen here a picture of what I think most of you are facing in terms of today's reality. Things have become much more complicated for our organizations when it comes to trying to protect data and the company assets, right? Think about not only employees having to access critical data in your corporate network or in the cloud environments that you're now using, but also the suppliers and business partners that you rely on and the risk that they potentially pose now to your organization. So things have become increasingly more complex, yet the goal is still the same. So if you think about it at a high level, there really is no more perimeter, right? Especially given the environment we're in now with COVID and everybody working from home, people have become the new perimeter. We also have this notion now of fragmented trust, right? When many organizations have gone through quite a bit of digital transformation over the last year, and that's been accelerated due to COVID. And so now we've got this notion of fragmented trust between the cloud environments that we're now using as a part of that digital transformation, and the responsibility for security between the cloud provider as well as our own organizations. And then last but not least, because of the expansion of the attack surface and where the data now lives, we're all faced with a sea of infinite noise, as they say, and trying to make sense of all the data that we're now collecting from our security investments. Charles, is there anything you want to add to this before we continue?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's pretty interesting. I think it goes without saying that most organizations had a roadmap or a plan to digitally transform a lot of their business in some way or another. I think that the main takeaway that I've found through all this is that we're really being forced to rapidly adopt new trends of not only just working, but also in thinking about how we protect our data and our employees. So it's been really interesting to see some of the concerns that come up, but it's been also equally interesting to see some of the things that folks have thought about as they start to go through this journey. So I'll give some anecdotes as we go on, but yeah, it's an interesting time for the industry as it's starting to occur at scale across businesses.
So if you think about this and dive a little bit deeper, there are some very specific challenges that come along with this new reality. And I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but I would like to pick out one and just comment on it before I turn it back over to Charles. And that is, this issue of having these siloed security solutions. Many organizations, like the one that I came from, we spent millions of dollars investing in a large security stack of products. Over time, we purchased point solutions to solve very specific problems. And although they may have helped us individually in that area or solve that specific problem, it still created issues for me in terms of being able to stitch together an entire story. We found it very difficult to have to go look in many different places at different logs to try to understand what was happening from an incident standpoint and how people were acting on the network, what they were interacting with on the network, what data they were accessing, so that we could adequately respond to it, figure out whether or not we had a real issue or were we just chasing some false positives. Charles, any of these in particular resonate with you in terms of specific challenges that you've seen or faced?
Yeah, from the customers that I'm working with, I oftentimes get asked about this problem of a lack of visibility. I think there's an acknowledgement that because of the rapid shift to put groups that might not be used to working remotely or just simply haven't done that in the past, there is an acknowledgement that there may be certain behaviors or activities that we just can't see with our traditional security stack. I've kind of seen the gamut in terms of concerns, all the way from we have groups that frequently print documents in an office setting, and we do have some visibility over that. And now they're forced to print things from home, and we're completely in the dark as to what we're doing. The other thing as well is that because people are adopting the working patterns, we just have a little bit of a mystery in terms of what they might be doing from a behavior standpoint. So the question is, how do we get the best levels of visibility to how those people are working to try to curb threats, but also not create additional noise where we're just not getting value out of that? So that's been on a lot of people's minds, and absolutely have some thoughts on how we can get around that.
Yeah, and so when I talk to customers or potential customers about this, it's a matter of well, where do we go from here, right? What is it that we can do? It's kind of the definition of insanity, if you will, to continue to do the same things and expect different results. So we would like to talk with you about kind of our point of view and how organizations should start thinking about this moving forward to be more successful in terms of protecting their data. And if you think about it at its core, regardless of where you're at with your digital transformation in your organization, you always have two constants. You have people and you have data. And it's the interaction between the two that helps create value for your organization. That value that's created for the organization can be in terms of innovation, it could be in terms of growth, it could be in terms of productivity. But at the same time, we also know that as users interact with data, that can also present risk to your organization. Think about it in terms of the different types of threat actors, right? You could have a well-intentioned employee who simply clicks a link and makes a mistake and all of a sudden exposes the organization to something bad. You could have an employee who one day is good and is creating value for the organization, but becomes disgruntled and ends up turning on the organization and starts to do harm, whether it be offloading data or doing other things. And then last but not least, you could have an external threat actor who compromises the credentials of a good employee and starts to use them for nefarious purposes. So the reason I bring all that up is because this notion of value and risk is a continuum, and it's never static, right? So it changes over time, whether it's seconds, minutes, hours, days, etc. So what makes us think that static security policies will be effective in an environment where risk changes on a very quick frequency? Charles, anything else to add here?
Yeah, no, it's you brought up a couple of really interesting points about switching to a dynamic view of user risk. What I get really excited about when I start to think about harnessing this sort of model moving ahead is what we could do in terms of workflows and real-time countermeasures to start to educate and curb really serious incidents that occur. It's interesting because in the past we've been, as an industry, very event-centric in how we look at the overall view of our security stack and our people. And this is kind of an interesting shift because if we can harness this, we can get ahead of a lot of these bad things that happens. We can, again, educate our end users and set up things so that, we don't get in a bad spot from a protection standpoint. So we'll go into detail about that, but I'm really excited about what we can do when we harness this model.
Great, thanks, Charles. So we believe that people and data have to be the center of your design thinking moving forward. If you think about where we've been, most organizations have taken a very infrastructure-centric approach to security. And as I said before, it's using static policies, one-to-many enforcement of those static policies that unfortunately for many of us have generated many, many false positives. It's resulted in our organizations having to do a lot of exception management in order for the business to be able to get its work done. And you end up having to have your analysts spending more time chasing things that aren't necessarily real or necessarily important. So what we believe is that there needs to be this shift from this infrastructure-centric approach to something that's more behavior-centric or risk-adaptive, something that adapts to the risk at any given time, as we said before. So it's more of that people and data-centric approach that we're really after. And so this approach that we're talking about is in line with something called CARTA. CARTA, for those of you who don't know, is a model that came from Gartner several years back, and it stands for Continuous Adaptive Risk and Trust Assessment. And what it is a risk adaptive protection that dynamically applies monitoring and enforcement controls that protect the data based on the calculated behavioral risk level of users and value of the data accessed. Charles, you want to kind of go through and talk about some of the key elements of this model?
Yeah, absolutely. So to kind of set the stage, again, think about all the challenges that we have today. When we write policies, they're typically one-to-many in terms of the groups that they affect. They are static, and then they don't follow users wherever they go, right? And so we absolutely, as an industry, have a need to shift to that sort of model. So when we really think about what CARTA means at the end of the day, there's kind of four key elements that ultimately comprise what they map out. So the first is that every user under our purview is going to have a unique and dynamic risk level, right? So that is going to be one-to-one in terms of how we look at that user. In addition to that, it's also going to be a risk level that can ratchet up, but also ratchet down as well. We oftentimes talk about implementing controls, but on the flip side, we should also think about how we can exonerate users as well. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but ultimately what we want to look at is their behavior, right? And so based on the things that they're doing that are good or bad, or I'd say more accurately, known or rare in terms of their overall behavior, we then want to heighten and lower those risk scores, right? And the idea here is that there's always a happy balance. Ultimately, we don't want to get into blocking or preventing any sort of normal business process, but we do want to increase the things we look at when we start to see things that are new and interesting and rare. So when we do that, ultimately, these risk levels are going to drive different outcomes. I'll go into this in a couple slides, but there's benefits to the end user because we can do passive notifications, for example, just an email. And a lot of time, it's just a question of folks don't know the rules, they don't understand them, or they haven't been articulated very well. But we can also drive outcomes for analysts as well, right? So, it doesn't make sense for us to look at people that are not risky at the same scrutiny that people that are risky. So we want to differentiate the user groups. But ultimately, when we start to do this, we can build controls and countermeasures that are going to adapt to how users are acting within our environment. So you get out of, as you brought up, Bob, that game of pre-gaming policies, testing, going through and validating them, and sometimes disrupting your existing stack there. So when we think about it this way, it creates a really interesting roadmap and path to have a modern program to prevent some of the threats that we're seeing today.
Yeah, and I think, Charles, what's really key for me, again, looking back, in my career, I wish I had this type of technology, because being able to institute risk adaptive controls at the user level, to me, is something that's truly game changing, because you can really eliminate a lot of friction from your business by being able to do that and help your business continue to grow.
Absolutely.
So why is it so important, right, that we move to this risk adaptive behavior-centric approach? What you're seeing here are three three breaches, three publicized breaches that have happened over the last several years. And, you know, there are many things that these breaches have in common. I guess the first is that they kind of all had long tails on them in terms of the amount of time after the breach that there was still an impact to the organization. They also, you know, all had to suffer through whatever litigation costs or whatever fines that were imposed on them. But I think more importantly, what they all had in common was that each of these breaches, the attacker or the adversary was on the network performing some negative behavior well in advance of the actual breach taking place. And so, like, if you look at Equifax, right, from May to July of 2017, Tesla from April of 2017 all the way to Q4 of 2018, and then finally Capital One from 2015 all the way through to 2019. So it's important for organizations to now start being able to see and detect this behavior through what we call meaningful visibility, and be able to ratchet up controls so that something like these breaches does not occur. And essentially what we're helping organizations do then is move what we call left of boom. Charles, anything else to add here?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. When I kind of look at breaches that exist in the news and things that pop up, we tend to also be focused on fines. But, you know, one thing that I think is really important to kind of keep in mind as to why this is so important is that, you know, as we brought up earlier, your value creation and your competitive advantage ultimately is the intellectual property that you create. So there's an element of protecting that so that, you know, your business can keep functioning. But in the case of somebody like Tesla, for example, those who are first to market and can maintain that competitive advantage have an enormous boost over their competitors. I mean, you just look at what's happening in the market today. Tesla was up at trading at 2140 yesterday at market open, and a large part because of that is because they're first to market with a lot of exciting technology that's out there, right? So for anybody who is creating data, they're you know, creating code, it is more important than ever that you can maintain that competitive advantage, not have somebody take that and then go to market before you.
Makes sense, Charles. So, you know, I think, you know, one of the questions that we get quite a bit after talking to customers about this approach and why it's so important is, okay, so how do I go about doing it, right? Talk to us a little bit about how we can actually operationalize this notion of behavior-centric risk adaptive protection.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the goal with this is not that you rip and replace your entire security stack or go and purchase a bunch of new things. The reality is that a lot of what we're speaking about is a methodology that you can do with a lot of your existing legacy security stack, plus some recent investments that you've done as well. This is really kind of the productization of what Gartner talks about in their Carter framework. And so we kind of think of it in three main elements here: being able to you know, do an analysis on human behavior, quantify risk, and then also do some automation. If I'm going to kind of simplify that even a little bit more, I'd say you want to have the best visibility possible. You want to be able to analyze all those events, and then you want to be able to take action on that analysis. So visibility, analysis, and action. Just to kind of go left to right here and maybe go a layer deeper on this. When we think about visibility, really what you're talking about is the interactions between people and data that we referenced to earlier, that your existing data security stack is kind of pulling out for you. Tools like data loss prevention, data tagging tools, and classification, these make really excellent catalysts for understanding how your users are touching data. That rings true for if they are on-prem, plus also if they are starting to go remote. I think the key here is to just make sure that whatever you've built kind of from a visibility standpoint will also follow users to where they are now working with data. And so for a lot of people, that has just been the legacy infrastructure that they built. For a lot of folks are being forced to go and have additional visibility into cloud repositories, for example, or just areas of the network or usage patterns that they haven't in the past. So that's absolutely key in kind of thinking of this first element. So once you've done that, you know, inevitably, and we brought this up earlier, there's going to be a lot of events that are created because of that, and there's going to be some noise that you have to cut through. So when I think of risk quantification, really what we're doing is synthesizing all of those disparate streams of data into a single source that an analyst or somebody who is a stakeholder within the business can go and easily look through to quantify risky users within your environment. The good news is that a lot of the analytics platforms that are on the market today can provide this for you. Most people have made an investment in those, but ultimately what we're trying to do is to bring all of those feeds of data together to give us, again, a single easy view into who is causing risk. What this does kind of as a result is it brings us from an event-centric view of risk and data security within our infrastructure to an entity-centric view. And when we think about it that way, it's a lot easier to focus on the individuals rather than disparate events. One anecdote that I have is that, back when I was a DLP analyst, it would take me 10 to 15 minutes just to go and look through and triage a very basic event. And when you have to think about doing that over scale and over time with a lot of users, there's just going to be things you miss. So when we kind of flip that model around on its head and look at it from a people-centric view, that makes it a lot easier to focus our efforts. So now, if we've done those first two, this is where the magic starts to happen, right? We're going to even dig in this a little bit deeper, but this ability to automate real-time countermeasures becomes really interesting when you think about the things that we can do when we understand how people are interacting with data, and then we have a quantification of risk for these users. We can essentially build analytically driven workflows to, again, both inform users, but also stop them from doing bad things. And as I mentioned before, there's also some benefits on the analyst side. But when you think about this kind of as a hierarchy and a scale, it's not just kind of like the block events that we want to think about. We also want to think about allowing good behavior, notifying and educating end users, and then doing some of those more controlled responses.
Yeah, Charles, I guess after listening to you go through that, there are two things that stand out for me. The first is, and you called it out right away, this notion of having to rip and replace. The answer is no, right? You can take advantage of the investments you already made to be able to drive the analysis and the risk quantification. And then the second piece is, being able to truly customize an automated response mechanism that makes sense for your organization, right? Some organizations are going to be more tolerant than others in terms of, being able to automatically put controls in place. So you can truly customize how your organization responds to protect itself based on the culture and on the level of risk. So just wanted to kind of circle back on those. I thought they were good points.
Great. So I want to dig a little bit deeper on this and talk about what this might look like if we take a specific user and we're to apply this way of thinking towards them. So I'm going to start just kind of left to right here. The way that we kind of think about things is that ultimately we'd want to deploy different risk levels to a particular user to create a scale of different responses that a tool set could take. If you're looking at this chart, just because we're here talking about data security, I think a data exfiltration use case is something that's interesting to look at. So kind of looking at the left and going right here, for risk level of 1, that's kind of what I'd quantify as our low risk user group, right? I think that level, out of any of the levels that we talk about, is actually one of the most interesting places to start for the business, right? And it's an acknowledgement that for the folks that are not showing signs of risk, but also doing the things that we kind of expect for that user or for that job role, they're probably not the people we want to put in focus in all of this, right? So what that can mean for an organization is that, we may audit certain events on the back end so that we have them in case of something larger that occurs, but ultimately we're not creating incidents or actionable events for those end users, right? I think it goes without saying that, again, when I look at my customer base, we tend to have about 1% of the user population as being high risk or showing signs of risk. So if you have people that are in good standing, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense to spend a ton of time on them or just going through events to triage them. Now, what will happen is, of course, when people start to do things that are outlying, rare, or just no bad, this is ultimately where we're gonna look for opportunities to escalate them up the chain. Some example of this, maybe just to make this a little bit clearer, is if we have somebody who is a iOS code developer, for example, and we normally see that the repositories that they access are, things we have on GitHub, for example. The data that they tend to move is source code related in nature. And then all of a sudden we see that they are accessing, I don't know, areas of the network that might be for the finance team or things that might be more PII related. That could be something that could boost them up, right? But ultimately, we still don't know if those are known bad necessarily, right? So we want to escalate them slowly. And now here's where we start to have an opportunity to bring more people into the chain to look at this. So at a risk level of 2, maybe what we want to do is create a case for that user, right? It's an acknowledgement that, number one, the risk level has risen, but also they're starting to do things that are different or rare or outlying from what we might normally see with them. So we want to, for example, create a case or a ticket for them. This now starts to bring the administrators and people in the data security program into the mix or into the fold and give them an understanding that something potentially could happen. Also, just from a opportunity cost perspective as well, as an analyst, those are the sort of things that I would want to look at and spend my time on versus like, hey, this is just a noisy policy, for example, that I'm tripping. Taking that same model and applying it maybe just a step up here, as somebody starts to go kind of to our mid scale of risk, this is when we want to start thinking about creating additional friction for the end user, right? So now we're bringing the user in the fold. This can be pretty simple in terms of how you think about it. It could be just an email or a notification to that end user to say, hey, we noticed that you're handling some data that maybe you shouldn't, right? The end user just might not be aware that they couldn't do that. And oftentimes it's just I'm going to call IS and understand exactly what I'm doing wrong. And then that's the end of the story. But in some cases, if somebody is doing something malicious or negative, this is kind of our first opportunity to bring some awareness that, the tools that we have and the different controls in place are going to start working a little bit different. This might also be an opportunity to, do something like a step up of authentication if we suspect that somebody might be malicious or, again, they might be compromised in some cases. So, if we have an SSO vendor out there and normally it's just username and password that we prompt them for, maybe now it's a 2-factor authentication. So we're starting to close that loop a little bit, bring in more tools to the mix to stop bad things from happening. And again, informing the end user and then informing analysts as well. So take that now a step further. They're starting to get towards the top of the spectrum. This is something that is now happening over time where they're, let's say touching data that they don't normally access. Maybe we're seeing, larger payloads of data movement that is rare or atypical for that user. This is when we can start to think about starting to tighten the screws from just a data security policy standpoint. Maybe we choose to block certain areas of access with a CASB tool, for example. Maybe a DLP tool will start encrypting files. So if this is something that is truly malicious, we are ensuring that data can't get in the wrong hands. Maybe we're also continuing that cycle of workflow notifications where it's a people manager, it's a line of business lead. Maybe it's even somebody in HR or legal or compliance just to get them into the mix. So now by this point, we've done a couple of interesting things. We've informed the analyst, we've informed the end user. Our tools are now blocking against very bad things that are happening. And now we're aligning the rest of the business to the fact that, there could be potentially something that we have to look at that could be damaging for our organization. Now, kind of at this top scale, and again, remember, we're usually only seeing this for 1% of the user base at any given time. This is where we want to start thinking about controls that are going to stop data motion in any form, right? And so, when we talk about data loss prevention blocks or cutting off broad areas of the network, that top risk level is where we can start to implement those sort of controls. So what that does is, again, that's going to create a layer of defense for the organization in case of somebody just completely doing something that's malicious. Maybe they're compromised or trying to cause harm to the organization. That way we're not seeing, crown jewels walk out, systems sabotaged, or just getting to a point where we can't easily recover. The interesting part about this is that if you set this up and done this correctly, it's only going to affect an individual user. So those more severe actions are not going to affect anybody else, right? So we don't block business processes. We're going to be following the user on everywhere they're going. And then, we have a way to create friction for that user to notify them about what's going on. So creates a really interesting roadmap to stop bad things from happening, all without requiring you to go and, pregame rules, test responses, and potentially, break or modify things that you were planning on doing. So Bob, I don't know if you have anything to say on that.
A couple things. One, I probably sound like a broken record here, but again, what's beautiful about this approach, regardless of what technology you're using, is again, it's at the user level, right? It's ratcheting up the level of controls on a specific user rather than impacting the entire organization. The only other thing I wanted to comment on, Charles, is we didn't talk about this in depth, but the risk models that are used to analyze the behavior and essentially drive the risk score. I think it's important that people kind of not try to boil the ocean, right? And try to keep it simple and try to focus on a couple of models. You'll see here we focus on 3 of them: malicious user, data exfiltration, and compromised user. So I think it's important to, again, try to keep it simple. Try not to boil the ocean. Use the data that you have as input to those models, and that will help lead you to success.
Nothing. If I could maybe even add one more point, kind of in that same vein. When it comes to thinking about what you bring into these models as well, keep that simple as well. I think there's obviously a lot of opportunity to bring in a lot of data into these feeds, but if it's not aligning to an overall mission, or it's not aligning to a very simple use case that you can think about and define, it's probably not worth bringing in, right? Because the more garbage that's brought into this, the more garbage that's going to be put out. So I absolutely am a believer in keeping it simple and bringing in the core tools that you need to make the best decisions possible that ultimately are going to map back to your user base. Great.
All right, so what's next, right? Let's talk about kind of the future and what we see moving forward from a modernization and maturity perspective. I said this in the beginning, right? A lot of organizations have made significant investments in their security stack within their data center or within their branch locations. Where we're headed as an organization, and once again we're in line with Gartner, is we are moving to a place where we can now provide customers with the ability to consume all the required security services to enable this risk adaptive or behavior-centric approach through what we call a SASE-based model. For those of you who don't know what SASE is, it was a term coined by Neil McDonald from Gartner a year or 2 ago, and it stands for Secure Access Service Edge. So think of it as a platform-based approach where you are now combining network and security services together and offering them in a cloud-based platform to your customers, and being able to have organizations like yours then consume those services to provide security to the user, regardless of where the user is, right? We all talk about this new normal and users working from home now permanently. So this is the way of the future. Organizations spent the first 90 to 120 days when COVID hit trying to figure out how to upgrade their MPLS circuits to be able to have more VPN traffic coming back into the data center to access applications and to access the security stack. And so now, after that 120-day period and they had a chance to breathe, they're starting to think more long-term about their strategy, right? What applications do they need to continue to transform into the cloud? And with that, how will they continue to secure users and data as users will be working from home or from their cars or from the hotel, et cetera. So, ForcePoint, at ForcePoint, we have taken this approach. We've got a couple of different products in place today across our SASE-based platform. Be more than happy to talk more in depth with you about it if you're interested. But this is the way of the future. I think you're going to see more and more organizations heading in this direction. Charles, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to this before we get to some of our closing remarks.
No, nothing to add here.
Okay. All right. Why don't you kick us off and just talk about some of the takeaways from our discussion today?
Yeah, so just again to wrap this all up and give you something to think about moving ahead. So it goes without saying that we need to rethink and evolve the way that we are addressing the data security challenge, just in the future, but also with what we're facing in the pandemic. Again, this is something that you don't have to re-rack all of your security tools. You can really take advantage of a lot of the things that you already built and put sweat equity into to enable this entity or behavior-centric approach. Analytics platform provide some of the greatest opportunities to quantify and surface risk. It also gives you that ability to become entity-centric instead of event-centric. And that's really where the key is, right? So if you want to harness these analytically driven use cases, you want to enact these real-time countermeasures, that's really what you need to think about in terms of enabling and deploying with the shift that's going on.
Yeah, and just to close out, right, being able to then use the the modeling to instrument those dynamic control points to enable organizations to become aware well in advance before a major event occurs. And then last but not least, start thinking about this secure access service edge approach to enabling data protection as you move forward and you think about your strategy several years out and how you can help your organization make sure that they're continually connecting users and data in a secure way, regardless of where they're located. So with that, we thank you very much. Our email addresses are here. I think that if you have any questions or want to talk further about this, feel free to reach out to myself or to Charles. Be happy to have a conversation with you. I think we may have some time, Scott, for some Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys for presenting that, Charles and Bob.
Thank you.
So what do you do about the organizations? I know in a traditional organization, you have a C-suite and from, everything, all the users are dependent on what IT and the C-suite decides, the CIO, these are the technologies you use. What do you say about those organizations that, well, with cloud apps, anybody can sign up. And in fact, a lot of the apps they can sign up for, even a Box account, a free one, you can use your corporate email address. You can sign up for these cloud applications that are outside of IT without involving any procurement because a team decides to say, hey, we want to use this as a collaboration tool, or we're going to start using House Party as the way to do our virtual meetings for happy hours. All of a sudden, you have these apps that people can download on their phones. They can sign up themselves and start to utilize. They can use their corporate email addresses. So it's somewhat tied to the company. Now, it doesn't mean their most sensitive data is going to this. How does that fit in where every users are not 100%? And I know this because I just took a kind of a generational seminar. You've got different generations from Generation Z, to generation, the millennials and Generation X and the baby boomers. I mean, my son just the other day, he's 10 years old and he set up an entire Discord, invited people and is posting YouTube videos. I showed him nothing on how to post, stream, set up Discords, link to other channels. He set up some bots within the Discord and it's related to gaming. A 10-year-old. And I'm like, how'd you get your accounts? What did you use? Oh, I just did this. And yeah, his password hygiene was a little rough and he didn't know what 2FA was until Fortnite forced him to do it. But I guess that's the point, is you've got different generation that says, I don't know what I'm doing on my device. And I didn't know I created a risk for the organization, to other ones that are just taking it and saying, I didn't know we had to have IT approval. How do you guys address that from a behavioral standpoint, from some of what you're saying? Because you've got from level 1 to level 5. What are your thoughts on that?
Charles, you want to take a crack at it first?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a couple things, right? I think that number one, organizations have to embrace these changes, right? If not only from a productivity perspective, the incoming workforce and then generations ahead of us, that's the way that we're going to know how to do business, right? So we have to look for ways to harness this because it can be a way to accelerate users' access to data. It can be a catalyst to help them create value quicker than they could in the past. So if we can harness that, I think that's a good thing overall. With that said, obviously, because anybody can go and sign up for these accounts, they can move sensitive data back and forth. There obviously are a lot of risks to this, right? So I think that there's an opportunity to sanction some of these apps internally, and so we should be mindful of this. But I think that we also have an ability to increase just user awareness in our messaging, right? I found that a lot of the times the reason bad things happen is because people just aren't aware of the consequences of, signing up for that free box account and throwing company data on it and not thinking about it again. I think that there's an opportunity for the business to educate users better. And then there's a fine line between, here's things you can use that will be approved and allow you to kind of do business in that way, but also bring awareness of the fact that, things could go wrong if that happened. In addition to that, it all comes back to having the right visibility, right? So, if folks are doing this from devices or platforms that we can start to look at and understand user behavior, that also gives us an opportunity to bring that into the fold. And even though there might be something that might not be, approved or sanctioned, we can still understand the data movement there and understand when we have to educate a user or, look to do some damage control there.
Yeah.
Bob,
do you have to have certain technologies like IAM, a DLP, CASB kind of in place to get to that maturity level of behavioral? Or can you just kind of jump right into it and say, yeah, we have some IAM and a little bit of DLP on our mail system, but is there a certain maturity level you have to have within your security program because you're going to take advantage of that stack with your next generation firewall and all the other pieces of your security program, that before you get into the behavioral, it's pretty hard to, you want to change the premise to start with that with your security program, but is there certain technologies you have to be more effective at doing that behavioral centric approach?
Yeah, I would say there's no one in particular or two in particular technologies you need to have to get started. I just think that the more that you can use as input to the analysis, the more enriched your data set's going to be, and the more effective your behavioral analysis is going to be. You can really start anywhere. If it were me, personally, I think you hit two of them, Scott, right off the top that I'd probably want to certainly take advantage of in terms of using logs to pull into the analysis, and those would certainly be my DLP and my CASB platforms if I did have them running in my environment. Charles, anything else you want to add there?
Yeah, another interesting thing to think about is tools that provide user activity monitoring. I think that DLP and CASB technologies do a very good job of understanding user behavior as it relates to moving data. But I think there's also an element, especially for kind of opening up the borders to other tools that might not be sanctioned, of understanding kind of broader human behavior and patterns that might not be tied to data as well. So tools that kind of look at, and answer volumetric questions of who is hitting a certain repository more than they have in the past, who is launching certain applications that are rare or unknown, could be interesting as well to bring in the fold. To Bob's point, I think you want to get as much actual data as you can in the mix, and it may be helpful to expand the aperture and also look at more behavior-based trends and logs in addition to things that are very data-centric.
Yeah, and I think the word context, I think, is important. I don't know that we spoke about that as much as maybe we should have today, but understanding the context behind the interaction between people and data, and part of being able to understand that context is to look at other types of behaviors that the user may be exhibiting. So to Charles' point, if you have an insider threat solution running that can help identify what a user's sentiment may be, right? People are human beings, right? And so I may be having a bad day one day. I may say some things in a chat window that might provide some additional context into the behaviors I'm going to exhibit in terms of the data I interact with later on. And it helps kind of paint that overall picture of context and what I like to call perceived intent. So I think, again, the more that you can ingest from an analytics perspective, you're just going to get more out of it and be able to have more context around what's going on.
Yeah, and as we work, and I say a point because as we work more at home, it seems that the visibility that security and IT might have of individuals work remote, right? Because all of a sudden now you've got one primary network. That was when they were in the office. We know where segmentation exists. We know how the wires are coming down to their offices individually. We know how the Wi-Fi and the WAPs are all set up. But all of a sudden, when we got introduced to this remote working en masse, you're introducing invisible items like printers and people's home networks and their
Yep.
Wi-Fi's and their 5Gs, and then their invisible devices that you're like, hey, look, I can log in. There's no host checker, so I can just log into OneDrive on any machine. And it's great because this machine, I can put files there, get into the corporate OneDrive. And at that point, I know it syncs up to my corporate desktop. And at that point, it didn't go through really kind of the controls necessarily it probably should, that you'd have a visibility of, well, how'd the data get there? Well, it got through an endpoint that we didn't have any visibility to. So is there some level of, if you're going to get that visibility, you really have to have in your security program how you're going to control access to those endpoints and what endpoints are going to be configured to allow access to your environment, and how do you prevent and ensure that users are going to go ahead and use that? They're not going to go ahead and start introducing endpoints you're not aware of, or places where it's connecting the cloud app, and at that point they're just putting data that you didn't know that there was a hole in the environment that you could upload just through the Microsoft Office 365 cloud services.
Yeah, Bob, you want to take that one, or?
No, you go first. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, so one thing, I'll just kind of bring this back to something we do at ForcePoint. So, a lot of the platforms that we're rolling out do have some level of device control. I think that, having a layer of that in the mix is absolutely critical. And there has to be a balance, right? We have to enable people to use things like, iPhones and tablets and, whatever might come out tomorrow, plus their corporate laptops. I think that if, you can find a balance of issuing devices that are known good, but also enabling people to use, at a very minimum, their mobile devices to do this, that covers the gamut for a lot of these platforms. Would I allow just kind of unauthorized third-party devices that I can't really control or can't deploy an app to have some layers of protection? Probably not at this point, because I think it introduces too many variables. But I think we can get 90% of the way there with corporate issued devices, plus a lot of the things that people just have from a mobile standpoint. Outlook is a really good example of an iOS app, and people are using Intune on their O365 implementations to control device and access, but also revoke data should the phone get stolen, for example. And I find that for most organizations, that's a pretty good balance of having something that's corporate and known good, but also providing some flexibility to work from home, work remote, but just their normal day-to-day lives as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, Scott, I think your question highlights exactly what it is that we're trying to get across today, and that is that regardless of where the user is or what type of device they're using, you need to start taking a different approach, because you don't necessarily have control over the device or over the location, right? So you've got to look at the behavior that the user's exhibiting when they're interacting with your data, regardless of whether it's in your data center or if it's in a public cloud environment. There are tools, and ForcePoint would provide what you would need here to be able to analyze what the user's doing, say, in any of those cloud environments we talked about, even if they're not coming back through your CASB solution that's on-prem. We provide capabilities now that give you a view into what those users are doing in those cloud environments without necessarily having to have them have an endpoint, a company-owned endpoint, or having to backhaul them to the data center. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I just that's good to know, because I think that's one of the places where maybe in security engineers, the corporations could struggle, is how do you get the behavior part? Do you profile them? Do you take it by the generation they're coming from? Is it a bring your own device kind of organization? Is it VPN always on the endpoints? How do decisions made about IT procurements and what's being used and what's not being used? Is there tight controls around that from administrative perspective and good policies around that? So I appreciate you guys presenting. I think this is a very interesting topic, and there's a lot of different areas to kind of look at to kind of figure out where in the stack people have existing technologies in their corporations and where you can get the behavioral side kind of perspective and looking at that. It's just not a performance issue or an availability, or there's a data integrity, but it's like, hey, there seems to be something here that's people might be mismanaging the data or putting it or moving it in mass volumes to a location that doesn't make sense.
Cool. Thank you very much for having us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
appreciate it, Scott. And again, our email addresses are here. If anyone has any questions or wants to have a follow-up discussion, feel free to reach out to us.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate you being on the Denver ISSA YouTube channel. Again, there's their email addresses. If you guys need a copy of the presentation, just go ahead and email one of us on the board, and we'd be happy to provide that to you. So thank you guys, and have a great day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay.